Welcome to Grappling with Greg, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us make clear choices and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I am Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guest for today. With me is Dr. Pauline Crawford, who is the conversation game changer. Her corporate heart team works to empower women and men with new understanding of fairness, respect for differences, and mutually beneficial business and life principles. Melissa Hughes is founder and principal of the Endrick Group, applying recent brain research to improve employee engagement, company culture, team dynamics, and innovation. And Brian Kelly is CEO and founder at Human Factors Consulting, LLC. He is an optimistic rebel and in good company, committed to humanizing leadership, relationships, and workplaces by creating the conditions for people to thrive so your business can too. Thank you all for being with me today. And here is the scenario we will be discussing. Last week, actor Kevin Spacey was acquitted of all the sexual abuse charges that have dogged him for 6 years. During that time, his acting career collapsed, and many predict that, with his reputation in tatters, he will continue to struggle to find roles. One of our foundational principles is guilty until proven innocent. But after so many high-profile incidents of sexual abuse, it feels wrong to allow alleged predators to carry on with business as usual when, in the event that they are eventually proven guilty, reaching a verdict often takes years, followed by years of appeal. On the other hand, genuinely innocent individuals can have their lives destroyed by accusers who are vindictive, misguided, or simply mistaken. Often, we may never know the truth, as with the charges leveled by Anita Hill against Clarence Thomas. To make matters worse, the choosing of sides often appears to be motivated more from political affiliation than on the basis of evidence. Trying a case in the court of public opinion led to the collapse of the 2006 charges against 3 Duke University lacrosse players, largely because of overzealousness on the part of the prosecuting attorney. The players won damages for defamation, but they were never actually exonerated in the courtroom. So here we are. Is there a practical strategy for protecting and supporting victims without rushing to judgment? And if we simply have to accept the imperfections of the system, does erring on the side of caution favor the accuser or the accused? Big topic today. The floor is open. Uh-oh.
I suppose the thing that occurred to me first is living in an honest world. You know, how can we actually evaluate honesty when we all have our own perceptions about anything, and we have our own perceptions about other people, situations? You know, we generally make assumptions which turn into judgments. So my feeling is we've got to keep that open mind, and what you said is so important. You know, are we guilty until proven innocent, or are we innocent till we prove guilty? Where are the injuries on the way? Where's the damage when somebody is wrongly accused? And then you want to make sure that the toxic people actually do get into some justice, and the people who are damaged get their justice. I think we have to explore, you know, why do we live in a world which is full of lies?
And of course, this is one of the classic challenges of ethics when you have competing principles, competing values. They are both fundamental, and yet they have trouble coexisting. Melissa, you look like you have something on your mind.
Oh, I was just going to say, I thought of, you know, that was my question too. What happens to, you know, what kind of damages does Kevin Spacey get, or the, you know, the perpetrator who has been cleared, or right? What kind of damages does he get? Because to your point, he may never be at the same status in the industry that he was when all this happened. That said, you know, the Me Too movement kind of happened because so many people didn't come forward, because they wouldn't be believed, because it was a hard road to to relive that terrible thing in your life and have people disparage your character. So I think I'm with Colleen. I think we need to have the same kinds of consequences for the people when it comes out, like in Kevin Spacey's case, he was exonerated. So the people that came forward, are there consequences for them? But then do people ever come forward again? Right? So it's a slippery slope. I don't know.
It is a slippery slope, and it's I love the perspective of like an honest society, and I think that's the intention. And I think when the judicial system was founded, I think it was well intended. The challenge is it's run by humans, and it's institutionalized over a period of time. And while he was legally removed from the charges and whatnot, a court of law, the system we have, found him not guilty, right? What if the system's wrong? And that's happened before. It doesn't happen a lot, but it happened before. So that makes it even more challenging to say, what's the right answer here in terms of our practical strategy? There's no perfect strategy, right? There's no perfect way to get it right 100% of the time. When you're dealing with human beings whose perspectives lie on a spectrum, right? What is the actual fact? This is the presented fact. How am I interpreting that? And through our lived experiences and our beliefs and whatever, we have a lens. Everybody's got a lens. And, while we all may be presented the same case, we may have different interpretations of what that is. And, that's could lead to an outcome that may not be reflective of what actually happened, but was what the evidence that was presented led them to. And that's the challenging part of it too, right? Integrity of the system, and that's a whole other discussion in and of itself. And and so how do you honor the human beings on both sides of this? And as someone that believes in innocent until proven guilty, that's where I lean typically. But then, as Melissa's inviting us too, is like, what if the person didn't do it, and their career, in this case, the career is basically taken a direction where they're not going to hire, and no one's going to hire him. It becomes and going back and punishing the victims, that's an interesting thing, right? So if they actually did go through it and they've been through this, now they're going to get penalized for coming forward, and that's not going to create the behavior we want as people coming forward. So fascinating topic. Thank you for including us.
Yeah, so I think about a couple of high-profile cases. Certainly, most of us probably remember the O.J. Simpson trial, where he was acquitted in criminal court, but he was found, I don't think guilty is the right term, but damages were found against him in the civil case. So, his innocence based on the system did not play out according to the civil charges that were brought against him. And to your point, Brian, I'm just remembering with Lance Armstrong that there were years of allegations against him using steroids, and he actually successfully sued many of those who had accused him. And when he finally came out, then all of a sudden those cases had to be reversed, and the restitution had to flow in the other direction. One of my rabbis would often say to us, Jewish courts don't care about the truth. And what he meant was that the court has to follow the evidence. And we don't know whether the evidence is adequate to support the reality of the situation. Again, your point, Brian, just because someone's acquitted doesn't mean they're innocent. And just because they're convicted doesn't mean they're guilty. So that adds a whole different wrinkle into the conversation. So
but also, Jonas, in addition to that, is the system flawed, or is the human brain flawed? Because I believe that jurors do go into that role with a great gravity of how important that position is, right? And I believe that people are able to put their biases aside and consider the evidence and come to a conclusion. What they cannot put aside are their own experiences. And those experiences color the evidence one way or the other. And so, I mean, so in that, if you look at it in that way, it's the human brain that is kind of flawed, not the system.
There's an interesting interplay between what you're saying, Melissa, and the system. Because the other thing that occurs to me with another famous case, which actually was guilty, which is Harvey Weinstein, and I'm very passionate about the marginalization of women and the women who didn't want to come forward because they were threatened. So how do we get a system where we get beyond the threat and people are able to really talk honestly? Because maybe they're not actually able to be honest with themselves because of some situation, which is, as you say, Melissa, has fried their brain. Oh my God, you know, was I at fault? Did I encourage that? You know, was I doing it because I wanted a part? What point did I realize it was not a good idea?
Right.
Because, you know, there are cases where you can see there must have been a point at which somebody might realize it's really wrong, but the perpetrator is still going free and wrecking lives. And, you know, how do we justify all that? How do we get the system to really obey that? And I think the police force and the criminal justice have an incredibly difficult job because we do need a system. But as you say, how do we make sure the innocent don't get fried?
You know, the famous quote from Benjamin Franklin, which he may or may not have said, coming out of the Constitutional Convention, when a woman asked him supposedly, what did you do in there? What did you create in there? And he said, a constitution, madam, if you can keep it. And when you look at the writings of the framers, they all were of one mind, and that the populace has to have a sense of core values, has to aspire to live lives of justice and virtue, despite our human imperfections. And that if you don't have that, then no system is going to work, because the system is only as good as the people who are utilizing it.
Yeah, and in terms of, you know, the system, right? So I think there's all well intent, right? And I think it works most of the time, right? It doesn't work all of the time. And so think about the cases like the one you mentioned, Jonas, and about O.J. Simpson, right? If you have resources and you're a defendant, you have to prove there's one element of possible weakness and raise doubt, and then you can get out of, even if you did it, right? And so that's the tough thing. And then, you know, the prosecution's got to make sure they present the evidence in a way that's compelling and proves without a shadow of a doubt. And then 12 people have to go in a room and decide and align to an actual outcome. And I don't know about you, I've been on a jury, right? I've been on a jury case. Did jury duty. And it was interesting how 12 people saw 12 different things. And this wasn't nearly a high profile case. It was a significant case because it involved something that, you know, obviously a criminal act, but it's interesting what Melissa said in terms of how we all have our own experiences and how that frames how we interpret the facts. And so is there a practical strategy? I think the founders had a pretty good practical strategy. What they didn't necessarily count on is the human element of it. And, you know, if I'm accused of something, my first instinct is to justify or self-protect in order to not get punished, right, as a human being. And then if I have resources, it's to get me the most powerful people to enable the fact that I don't get fined or whatever the penalty is going to be, jail time or even worse. And so the element of human versus the system is just another kind of instance of power kind of showing its ugly head in terms of societal equity.
It is. One of the things I was thinking, as you said that, Brian, is that the founding fathers didn't have social media and the media.
Yes.
So that was a lot simpler in those days. Even I remember a long time ago when it was simpler because you didn't have all
Yeah.
this information in front of you. I never been on a jury, and I can imagine that is so challenging. 12 different views.
And it's
Going
not just
back
the
to
information, it's, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Going back to Pauline's original point, though, about having a more honest society. So I guess, were we more honest when the framers were with us? Have we become less honest? I mean, I do work with, the Guardian Ad Litem program, and I'm in courtrooms all the time. And I can look at people and I know that they're sitting in court and they're raising their hand, and I know they're lying because I've seen them, like I've watched them. And that always astounds me. Like, I think to myself, does that mean nothing to you when you raise your hand and say, I swear to tell the truth? So are we less honest now because we've devolved morally? We've evolved technologically and devolved morally? I don't know.
Yeah, it's easy to romanticize the times of the framers, and this has been very much on my mind since I've been reading the biography of Alexander Hamilton, and he and Thomas Jefferson were bitter political and personal enemies. They just couldn't get along in anything, and yet when George Washington, who was desperate to step down as president, said that he wasn't going to run for a second term, they both went to him, I don't know whether individually or together, and said, you have to run. You have to be president because no one else can keep the nation together. And I think that's the difference between then and now, is that, yeah, there were horrible things said by both sides, exaggerations, misrepresentations, anonymous letters and broadsheets, they call them, and they were as vicious as anything that appears on social media. But there was this overriding sense that society comes first and that we have to make it work. Whereas today, I think there's a sense of, I just want to win. And then once I have that attitude, it's easy to justify almost anything.
Mm-hmm. I really saw that in the pandemic, right? We had that conversation a lot. Like, okay, you don't believe in the pandemic and you don't believe in masks, but if there's like this 1% chance that it's true, would you do your part to save the rest of us, right? That conversation was had a lot, and a lot of people were like, no, it's my right not to wear a mask.
Yep.
My right, so is it rights versus what's best for the greater good? This is off topic, but.
Well, it's completely off topic. It's when people go, what you said before is that people have their biases, whether conscious or unconscious. You remember that wonderful movie, 12 Angry Men with Henry Fonda, where 11 of them are absolutely certain that this fellow is guilty. And one person wants to just talk about it. And it's a remarkable film, and considering how old it is, maybe 50s, I think, yes, exposing the psychology of people in those situations. But if you don't have that one person who's in there who's going to be adept at drawing people out, it just isn't going to happen.
Yeah, that was a great movie. I think it's very interesting because I do a lot of work where I invite people to a space of no judgment, about any topic. And it could be, business issues, but also with women, talking about how women want the world to be, that is not toxic against them. And the issue is that we insist on the 3 rules: no judgment, no anger, no coercion. And so in the time span that we're talking, there's no judgment. You only speak from your experience. And then you don't get angry. You can be passionate, but you're not angry, because once you're angry, you change the space. And then no controlling in that time period. So no leaping to conclusions. And it works amazingly. And what I find is that when people come back again and again, they say, I really like this space because I don't have to bring my ego with me. And I wonder whether the ego is where we get tense about telling the truth in any situation. We all have those occasions where with a loved one, with a child or whatever it is, you don't quite want to say the truth because maybe it's going to upset them. And, you know, sometimes absolute honesty can hurt somebody. It's a fine line, but dishonesty, when it's a blatant lie, I think that's what we need to bring back, some kind of humanity consciousness, some, you know, what I would call a moral code, that what I was brought up with, you know, I didn't throw litter on the street. I didn't swear at anybody. I was, you know, I had done, my parents would have taken me to my room and said, stay there, you know, and that was okay, because I think people have lost some respect for the universe they live in and the humanity around them. And I'd like to bring that back.
Love that, Pauline. And so I'd like to come back to the concept of winning, right? We talked about winning and that being the energy. And if we're talking about the case that we have, you know, with Kevin Spacey as an example, and the judicial process, the jurors are the deciders ultimately, right? But think of the two attorneys that are trying to win for their clients, right? Even if the prosecuting attorney has, and I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but you know, he's going to present the best case to try and prove that the event happened, and the defense lawyer is trying to get put the best defense forward. But the energy feels like, from the lawyer's perspective, is winning, while the jurors may be intent on the best outcome. But if they're intent on winning, how true is the evidence becomes my question and curiosity. And then how true is the system if we're not making decisions based on true evidence? And that becomes my my concern and my challenge for the best system we have, which if we had a better one, we'd be using it, right? And you know, the humanity of it. So, you know, even if you just, you know, TV is a mirror of life, right? You watch Law and Order or one of these things, it's always about, you know, angles and finding the weakness from the defense's perspective and trying to get evidence. What if somebody withholds evidence intentionally, right? What can you do about that if you don't know about it? You can't do anything about what you don't know. And so I think, you know, when we get to the, is there a right answer, practical strategy thing? Of course there's not. But what if we held the players and the actors in this sort of story, in the court system, for instance, the ones that are supposed to be upholding the integrity of the system, to even a higher standard, right? And what if they were penalized for, you know, what if the rules needed to be modified and nuanced so that it could be more human, and so that the honesty that Paulina was inviting us to, and it was less about winning, more about justice. What if that, you know, became the frame?
Yes.
And certainly there's stories of prosecutors who found evidence to exonerate the defendant. In some cases, they revealed it. In some cases, they concealed it because they wanted to win. And one's noble and one's reprehensible. And then the other way around. One of the classic ethical questions that we think of and we hear is, how can a lawyer defend someone they know is guilty? And I mean, you need to have a mechanism for defending people because you don't know who's guilty. But, you know, again, going back to OJ, Marcia Clark, the prosecuting attorney, she had been a very successful criminal attorney. And when she got off a murderer that she knew was guilty, she was so disgusted with herself that she gave up a lucrative criminal defense career to become a prosecutor. I don't know how many people struggle with that.
There's a case that was just sentenced today. The shooter from the Tree of Life was sentenced to death today. And I actually was thinking about the trial was, I don't know, a month ago or whatever. And I was thinking about that. How do you, I get everybody deserves a defense, but in that case, he clearly did it. There was no question that he did it. And so how do you fight for him to be free. And in that case, I think the system won, the system held because, because I think most of us, whatever you feel about the death penalty, the guy needed the consequence. That guy did, that was a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. And he got his representation, and the jury said, no, that's not who we are. Right. And, yeah, but that's a tough one. I couldn't do it. I would be a terrible defense attorney.
I think you'd make, you can argue in a case like that. There's a teaching by the sages. It says nobody would ever violate the law if not overcome by a spirit of insanity. So the insanity defense is something that actually goes back thousands of years. But nevertheless, there's still a system. there's a kind of philosophical insanity that how could I do something that's contrary to the well-being of society and myself? And then there is actual clinical mental illness. And if a person, not every thief is a kleptomaniac, but there are kleptomaniacs there who have a compulsion they can't control. So, I think that was the issue in the Pittsburgh trial. Was this person sufficiently in control of his own decision-making that he deserved to be treated accordingly and punished accordingly? And, you bring in experts, you bring the jury has to decide. I don't know how you make choices like that. It can be, as you say, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And let's flip the case that we have as the case study on its edge. What if he was convicted, right? What is the right punishment, right? Is it, so, and I think it varies by state, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of what you can choose as possible outcomes. It becomes even more, questionable, I guess, in terms of who's making this, and is it truly a fair system.
I really like that point, because what occurs to me is there's no universal justice system, because it's all controlled by different countries, different states, different religions. Somebody asked me, what is toxic behavior? I said it's anything that damages anybody, be that a knife, a
That's simple,
or a nasty word that upsets somebody. It's all toxic. For me, it's why do we choose to do that when we've got a lot of other things to deal with in the world? I think being angry and violent is a terrible injustice to humanity.
Thomas Jefferson wrote that we hold these truths to be self-evident. Are we getting to a place where there's very little that's self-evident anymore? We simply can't agree on core values anymore, and that's really quite disturbing.
Yes. I find it interesting, because I don't know a lot about the justice system in America, because I'm living in America, but I'm British. But I don't actually know a lot about the justice system. So what this conversation has made me think about is actually looking into that and exploring, how can you make it universal and fair? And is that ever possible? And maybe the robots will take over and do it differently.
Well, that carries its own set of problems.
yeah.
And when we talk about fair, as you said, ultimate justice is in the realm of the deity. We can do the best we can. How can we make the system work as well as humanly possible?
Yeah.
And then we accept that sometimes it's not going to work. But we still have to take responsibility for doing the best we can.
Yes.
Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. When that's all there was, that was the best we could do. But now we have DNA. I mean, my father was a witness in a armed robbery. The one of the accused had been in our house working a party that my parents were having at the time that the robbery took place. I've always wondered, I'd like to go back and find out why was that not considered a sufficient alibi that he shouldn't have been tried at all? Why did the prosecutor go ahead with charges when this person had an ironclad alibi? And all I can think of, without knowing, of course, is that the victim of the crime who identified him was so certain that he was the one who was there that made it worth a case. That made it a case worth following. But the whole structure of it it's been 60 years or 50 years, but it still baffles me.
And the hard part is that person might absolutely believe,
Right.
that is so ingrained in their memory banks that it isn't that they're lying. So I think there's a difference between lying and faulty memory, right? Because to your point, eyewitnesses are terrible. They're terrible. And the human memory is pretty terrible. The human memory is not like a, VCR where okay, now I'm showing my age, but you know what I'm talking about. It doesn't like record an event and we play it back. The human memory remembers bits and pieces, and then we stitch them together with what we think makes sense based on the emotionality of the event, right? So so I mean that's a whole nother layer of people aren't necessarily lying, they're just remembering it wrong.
That's back to the human element, right, Melissa? It's,
Right.
I'm not lying, but my recollection might be faulty for
Right.
whatever reason. And that introduces faultiness into the whole process, right?
Right.
And that's right, because it's about fact and fiction. So the facts are the facts, but the fiction is what we felt about it and the angle we were seeing it from. And it's all tied into the story that we make up about the facts. And I suppose that's what the justice system is aiming to do, is to get to the facts. And the jury is looking at the facts, but the emotions are going to be there, the perceptions are going to be there. It's a fascinating debate here. I'm really pleased that you invited me, because it's a very interesting case. I haven't read all the detail about the Kevin Spacey thing, but there must be a deal of perceptions and misperceptions, misunderstandings, as opposed to the murderer, the guy who murders people. And there's sort of more coherent facts. But in Kevin Spacey's, it's all about his reputation and opinion and different opinions. And that's the challenge I think we've got in the world today. There's a lot of anger and polarization is happening. I always say two polar opposite people are actually the same. People laugh at me, but I say, well, it doesn't matter what they're saying. If they're polar opposites, they're never going to agree. So they have a similarity at some point. So it goes back to, how do we create an honest world?
But also, we make sense of the world through story. We don't make sense of the world through fact. I mean, for how long was the world flat, right? I mean, so
Yes.
we make sense of the world through story, and we'd like to think that we're rational people that are sometimes emotional, and that's not true. We're emotional people all the time, who are, once in a while, if we're lucky, we get rational, right? And we're able to look at the facts. But I mean, that takes intention, but our default is emotion. And that emotion is around some story that makes us feel something, because
yes,
we
absolutely.
feel before we think.
Well, that's the key, isn't it? Because in the justice system, in the criminal court, the prosecutor and the defender are, the prosecutor in particular, I would imagine, is dealing with the facts and trying to be not emotional. But as you say, just Melissa, everything is about emotions. It's how do we really be honest with our emotions with each other? I always think, getting to know ourselves is one job, but getting to know other people is your superpower, and most of us don't do it very well. I don't mean the present company, because I think we probably but that's what I find out there is we live in this whole world of misperceptions, and that's something that's happening. So it's okay, in a sense. It's what we do to get into that magical space of no judgment and listen. And I always say to people, you might be in that space and not like something, but it doesn't mean you grab the throat of that person or shout at them. It means you might say, oh, that's an interesting perspective. Pause, allow it to be there. Most people don't do that. They leap at something, or they disappear, or they get angry.
Aya says in the comments that she thinks emotion is fact itself. And in a sense, it is from our perception. It's what we would consider a fact, or you can even say it's a fact that I reacted in a certain way. But then when that changes my perception of the incident itself, now we're shifting, I think, away from fact and into subjectivity.
Yeah. And the incident, right? So the incident and the whole thought process around fact versus story, right? So if you look at what happens in courtrooms, there's a lot of storytelling and positioning happening, right? It's, yes, the prosecution's focused more so probably on the facts to try and prove the case, and the defense to some extent, but why are opening and closing arguments such a powerful thing that gets celebrated on television, but is actually what happens in the courtrooms too? It's, how do I, even if you're just sitting there, I remember like A Few Good Men, Tom Cruise is telling the fellow lawyers, just don't move, don't act like everything's just fine. It's like, it's just a show, right?
Yeah,
it ends up being a show and a storytelling exercise to some extent. And some people are better storytellers.
Yeah.
And the facts may be what the facts are. Prosecution could be completely right, and but the storytelling and how people, and so that gets back to jury selection, right? Are they selecting people that are more likely to vote their way, or they're selecting people that are going to be good jurors? And that's an interesting question. My experience tells me one thing, and I think the intent was probably different than that.
Yeah, and that would probably be a good topic for another episode. But as we wrap up, you just got me thinking. Melissa, you could probably speak to this more, but I heard it from Jordan Peterson, not personally, saying that people's natural personality types influence often their political outlooks, so that people who are more open are more likely to be liberal, people who are more orderly are more likely to be conservative. So, and then of course you've got environmental influences as well. And his point was that very often we don't so much choose our political views, they are shaped by forces that are outside our control. So coming back to our case, if I'm more conservative, I may be more inclined to say, let's look at the person as innocent and treat him as innocent, even though there may be a danger to others. If I'm more liberal, I may say, we have to protect the innocent, and therefore we need to err on the side of caution that this person might be a predator. And both those positions are legitimate. And what often we come back to, especially in this forum, is that we didn't bite off more than we could chew for this topic, but we don't necessarily come to conclusions or solutions. But having the conversation is valuable, because it helps us frame the issue more clearly and understand the dynamics involved.
Yeah, I understand what you just said. Is I'm reading a book called Subtle Acts of Exclusion, and it's all about microaggressions, and we have them. We cannot get rid of them. We cannot walk through life without having bias. We don't even know what our biases are most of the time. We have the bias blind spot. And so part of the strategy is you have to say, we're going to have subtle acts of exclusion. We are going to have microaggressions. And when you say that, it's like going into a kindergarten classroom and say, we make mistakes here. It gives you permission to make mistakes. Like it just accepts that that is part of it, but it also gives you permission to identify it when it happens. And, I think kind of that is where you're, if I'm able to say, this is what I'm thinking, and I think this is the thing that's shaping that opinion, in me, or the external factors around me, the influences. But I think identifying that means you first have to accept that they're there, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's a good note to wrap up on. That self-awareness is often the key to at least beginning to solve all of our problems. Because if we can at least see where we are in danger of being, to your point, Pauline, dishonest, whether intentionally or unintentionally, recognizing that we have biases, as you say, Melissa, doing what we can to check ourselves or allow others to check us so that we don't go off too far in the wrong direction, and that we keep each other honest. And if we can do that, then at least we're trying to turn the ship in the right direction. So I thank you all for the conversation, for tackling this particularly thorny issue. Dr.
Thank
Pauline
you.
Crawford, Melissa Hughes, Brian Kelly, thank you again. Look forward to our next conversation. For those of you who are watching or listening, if you have a topic that you think is compelling, please go to my new website, ethicsninja.com. Use the contact information there. Send it in if it's something that's worthwhile. We will definitely take it up. And until then, I urge you to continue to grapple with the gray.